United Nations peacekeepers and unidentified armed forces exchanged fire on Monday in the Central African Republic's capital, Bangui. A spokesperson for the mission said the brief fight broke out when a group of unknown gunmen opened fire at a UN patrol. Hundreds of residents are calling for the mission's departure from Bangui, which is understood to have sparked the clash. Criticism of the 13,000-strong mission has mounted in recent weeks, with locals accusing the peacekeepers of not doing enough to protect them. Civil society groups have called for a general strike to pressure the troops to leave. Let's get you more now on that story, and I'm joined live from New York by our UN correspondent Lorna Shadik. Lorna, has there been a response from the UN on these protests in the Central African Republic as yet?
Well, we reached out to the spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General, who confirmed that the MINUSCA has indeed reported gunfire and incidents of looting in several neighbourhoods of Bangui. And they also said that there are preliminary reports of a number of casualties, unconfirmed as yet. But it said those reports suggest at least 4 UN peacekeepers have been injured in that action in Bangui. It said government security forces and UN peacekeepers have now both been deployed to contain these demonstrations, and they're monitoring the situation closely. The UN then went on to say it is committed to supporting the people and the authorities of the Central African Republic in accordance with our mandate, it said. But that chimes in with what the peacekeeping mission's also been saying on Twitter as well. It said that it's reinforcing its air and ground patrols in Bangui to protect the population of the city, and it said that they operate with strict impartiality and strictly within their mandate, which is, of course, to protect civilians and support the transition process. So some reaction from the UN with a bit more detail of what's been going on, as well as just reinforcing their position that they are there to protect civilians.
Well, it is highly unlikely, though, that the UN mission will leave. So how will the UN handle this growing anti-UN sentiment to the C.A.R.?
Well, there certainly has been a lot of anti-UN sentiment just over the last few weeks or so. Locals say the peacekeepers just aren't doing enough to protect them. Of course, that comes after that attack by C.A.R forces earlier this month, where we saw 30 people killed and dozens wounded. And of course, the ongoing accusations of sexual abuse by peacekeepers, which the UN is looking into. And there was a petition, in fact, calling on MINUSCA to go. But I think, as you say, it's unlikely to accede to those demands, particularly at such a critical time for the country as it's trying to emerge from this crisis and build up sort of new institutions in the country. And in fact, AFP reports that one UN spokesman went on local radio and said, look, we can't lie to people here, to Central Africans, and say that there are national armed forces that can protect them. Instead, the implication being that the UN is necessary there to protect them from any violence. And we know that the UN has been active in doing things like trying to get armed militia out of school so that children can resume their education and get back to school. And if it's successful in actions like that, I think that is the best way that it's going to be able to win hearts and minds and win over the local population and prevent these kinds of demonstrations. But ultimately, really, the only way to win over local people is to make sure that this violence doesn't repeat itself, and that they can go about their business peacefully.
Right, Lorna, aside from that, though, what's the latest on the investigation of alleged sexual abuse by UN peacekeepers in the C.A.R.?
Well, of course, MINUSCA has been dogged by these accusations ever since it arrived in 2014, and separately, French peacekeepers have also come in for the same allegations. Now, a peacekeeping official here in New York just a little bit earlier this month said they've now interviewed over 400 complainants and witnesses as part of this investigation, and the evidence is now being reviewed internally by the Office of Internal Oversight Services to make sure that peacekeepers are held accountable. But it's interesting to note that Reuters recently uncovered what seems to be a draft memo from the UN's Chief of Field Support, Conduct and Discipline. And that, interestingly, said that they felt many of the accusations that have been filed seem to follow a pattern and, according to the memo, lack specific details and fell apart when investigated. In fact, the memo says around 50% of the cases weren't supported by any evidence. So it seems that internally, at least among the UN, there seems to be some skepticism, if indeed this memo is correct, about the stories of at least some of those who've come forward, which I guess is perhaps unlikely to help the UN win over those hearts and minds in the C.A.R. as it tries to go about its business there.
All right, Lorna Shadik for us there in New York.